You may have seen my video on drawing the effect of detail rather than drawing the exact detail, which in scenes such as this field of flowers can be overwhelming to draw or even impossible to draw. And look, if you've missed this video, it's worth a watch. But what if we're not talking about flowers? What if we're talking about a different type of detail? What if our detail is architectural? And the problem may not be so much the detail, but the scale that we have to draw the detail in. So we have perhaps some architecture closer up that we could draw, but as it moves away from us, it becomes so small and everything becomes so close together with foreshortening that it really becomes impossible for all sorts of reasons to draw the detail exactly. How can I capture the effect of the detail in a way that my street scene drawing still looks real? Let me talk through my demo of drawing this scene, explaining the choices I made to get this drawing, and at the end I will show you a few minutes of real-time footage which you might find helpful as well. But we're going to start now with the section of the street that's closest to us, that we'll draw with the most detail. In a way, we always draw the effect of what we're drawing rather than the exactness, because for most things, except the simplest of objects, there simply is too much that we could capture exactly. But in this case, we're doing it quite deliberately, simplifying what we draw to get the feel of our subject. So we're not just simplifying, we're not just removing every second line, we're making choices which parts, what are the key visual elements of our scene, of our objects that we need to capture so that our mind, when we look at our picture, sees what's there and presumes what's not there, what we haven't drawn. That's what we're trying to do. So in this building that's closest to us, we're going to do the most detail in this drawing. So with a 0.3 millimeter pen, I'm just working out, I'm also trying to get the proportions here. I didn't make this end of the building quite wide enough, but I'm not going to let that worry me, or else I made the window too large. Whichever way you want to look at it has the same effect. But I am putting more lines here for what I draw, and they're heavier lines, and I'm having darker values with my hatching. And that's partly because darker values come forward in a scene and lighter ones go back. So controlling the values that we're created with our lines is a way of creating a sense of depth. And what I will be doing is I'll be changing pens as I move back. I'm starting with a 0.3, but I will switch to a 0.2 and then to a 0.1, and then I'll be doing the very furthest parts across the cross street at the very end of this street that I'm drawing now in a 0.03 millimeter pen. The most important thing in a scene like this, in my view, is to get the perspective angles right. This diagonals that go down the full length of the street, they're not exact diagonals, they're not lines that line up across the faces of every building, but the lines that are formed by the tops of the windows and the bottom of the windows and cornices and balconies and other architectural elements do create the same system, the same pattern of lines moving towards the top left to the center right, because they are all going to the same vanishing point. All of these buildings are lined up one after the other in a straight line. And so all of the horizontal lines across their facade, or architectural elements that create horizontal lines, all of these lines will go to the same vanishing point. So creating this pattern as we move along the street is probably the most important detail to get right. And it's a little bit trickier because it's not actually a straight line. We can't just draw these lines in at the very start of our drawing to capture them. we have to, as we go along building by building, and as these lines move up and down according to where the windows and the floors start and finish, they change. So, but we still have to keep this pattern, this sense of all of these lines are going to the same point if our street is going to have a sense of being real. And so this will be a very important way to capture realism. At ground level, we also have to simplify the detail, because in a busy street scene, we have lots of objects in front of each other, objects layered. And so what I find is important is to draw the closest ones with most detail, and then as we move backwards, we reduce the detail, and that helps the closest objects come forward. It helps our eyes see them and sense that they're closer, create separation with what's behind. And this includes hatching, but the important thing is we bring the hatching down so that we actually don't quite touch the outline or the formwork of the figures, the objects that are in front. So we can be transitioning to drawing more detail as we go from left to right down the street, but we can also be transitioning to more detail as we move from where most of the objects are forward closer towards the viewer. And if I'd included the figure that's closest to us in this scene, then I would have been drawing that figure with more detail than I have the other figures. So I'm finishing a few details in the foreground here. I'm still using my 0.3mm pen. And I've got one more building, I think, before I change to a 0.2mm pen. And in some ways, it was getting difficult to draw with this thickness of line at this point. Now you can see I do a bit of work just trying to make sure these perspective angles are in the right place. And we often capture the architectural detail as much by negative space when it comes to windows that we're looking at from an angle. We're drawing the shadows, particularly at the top of the windows, and particularly where the windows are set deeply, as they often are with older architecture where there are very thick walls. Another important thing in capturing the effect of architecture with these balconies is to make sure we draw the brackets. In a scene such as this, there are a lot of lines that are basically vertical, but the brackets that hold up the balconies are a very nice visual variation. And so we want to get a strong sense of those and that they look how they should, and sometimes simplifying the four. If they're particularly ornate brackets, from this distance it doesn't matter, so it's probably better just to make them simpler but very clearly brackets, and it's usually the shadow at this point which shows off the curve of the brackets. So I switched to a lighter pen, and I'm also trying to use it with a fairly light touch. I'm probably pushing the detail that I'm doing here. I'm still wanting to define each window and to create a sense of shadow at the top of each window with what becomes really no more than a dot. And you can see me continuing to check the perspective angles. The other really important angle that I've checked and you've seen me do an indication of is the ground level line. Now, ground level doesn't necessarily fit into our perspective pattern, because if the ground's not flat, it won't be one of our perspective lines. It won't go back to the vanishing point on eye level. But if our ground is flat, or relatively flat as this ground is, then it will join at the same point. So it's important that that line, even though there's no actual line there, gives us a sense that it is going to meet up at the same point. So I'm still working with my 0.2 millimeter pen here, and I'm trying to get just a sense of where some windows perhaps are arches rather than squared off at the top, or where there's a few little decorative elements, perhaps an arched cornice, like a circular pediment or a little triangular pediment at the top of the window. They're the things I'm trying to draw, that I'm trying to include in this. So now I've switched to a 0.1 millimeter pen with some relief, because I was having trouble starting to get the lines as close as I wanted to. There looks like there's a bit of a gap in the streetscape that I've just drawn. What this actually is a building's been demolished, and so the side of the building that we can now see is clad in black plastic. But I thought it actually created a very nice visual breathing space as we move down the street. It could have been a laneway, in effect, the way it operates in this drawing. So I didn't try and draw the black plastic that was clad in it, or the beading that was holding it in place. Instead, I push on, taking care with my perspective angles sit still. Besides the perspective angles, the other important line direction that we have to consider as we move along is the vertical. There's so many vertical lines, and it's really important that we keep them vertical, that they don't start to lean one way or the other. And that's surprisingly easy to have happen, especially when we have to hold our heads sideways because there's a camera in the way. So checking every now and then that our lines are well and truly vertical is important. And there was one point where I think my lines were leaning at the top towards the right slightly, and so as soon as I saw that, I was able to adjust them back into being plumb with the vertical. So I've kind of got a pattern now, as well as the perspective angles being correct. The other thing we want to really capture is the roof line of architecture such as this, where we have these kind of end-on gables, and as well as various chimneys, some with chimney pots, some without, and some little turrety things happening. We want to make sure we get a sense of those. It's the outline that we need to get accurate, and the scale. It doesn't really matter if they line up with what's underneath them in the drawing as in the reference, but it's more getting a sense of these elements are way down the street, which of course speeds things up a lot. Now I'm doing the very furthest buildings at the end of the street using my 0.03 millimeter pen. I feel like this really just scratches the paper more than anything else. I really don't like drawing with something this fine normally, but it does give a wonderful light effect, which really does create the effect of distance. See, I keep saying the effect, create the effect of, because we want to draw just enough now that the brain will have a sense of, yeah, I know what that is. I need to simplify the outlines at this distance to give a sense of this is a roughly triangular bit of decoration, this dormer window, and so forth. Now I've picked up my 0.3 millimeter pen again to do this tree, because this tree on the right is level with pretty much with the tree on the left hand side. So I wanted to have a sense of coming back forward now, and then I switched though to a lighter pen to do just a hint of the building on the right hand side of the street. And there's a little bit of the little view of the left hand side of this closest building that fortunately I remembered to draw in at this stage. So it really is getting a sense of, at a glance, what do I see? At a glance, visually, what attracts my attention. And it really is, as we move further up the street, it's the fact that all these lines are vertical, but also that all these architectural elements and line up with a pattern, with a perspective pattern, with the fan-shaped perspective pattern that we get when everything goes to the one vanishing point. And I need to capture that to have a realistic effect created. So here we have our street scene, which, by the way, is in the magnificent Belgian town of Ghent. So let's just have a closer look at our line work. So I focused on getting these perspective angles correct in establishing the fan-shaped pattern of lines that we get when a wall of architectural features are all aligning with the one vanishing point. And particularly important were the lines formed where the tops of the windows were or where the bottom of the windows were, particularly the tops, because they tend to cast a bit of a shadow, which we can indicate the effect of just with a little blob at the top of our window, and keeping these lines angled adequately. Now, while the tops of the windows and the cornices create a great visual effect, at other times we want to use every chance we get to vary this effect. And so where we have different elements of architecture happening that we can suggest, it's important to take advantage of that. And sometimes just creating different dark shapes which indicate that there are shadows being cast by some sort of architectural element. As long as the shadows follow the perspective angles, then our brain will create architectural detail or presume architectural detail to cause those shadows to take place in that pattern. And as I said in the video, we don't even have to align these elements particularly with what's underneath them, but we do want to include them if possible, because silhouettes are always particularly important for our brain to create meaning, to understand context. Silhouette edges are visually more prominent than most lines. And as we get right up the end here, particularly towards ground level, there are less and less lines, but it's important that the few lines we draw do suggest something. So there are just a couple of diagonal lines that suggest shop awnings, and because we have fairly prominent examples up here, when we see a hint of them down here, we know exactly what they are. So having just a couple of simple lines that echo details that we've got closer that we can see helps the brain to understand that this is what we have up here. That with a few simple lines, we've created the effect whereby our brain can now read and understand the greater detail that we have actually drawn closer. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Of course, this reference photo is on my channel community page if you'd like to have a go at drawing this scene yourself. But don't go away just yet. I've got a couple of minutes of real-time drawing of various parts of this. But look, whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.